Assalamu alaikum and welcome. My name's Amandeep. I'm an international reporter and filmmaker. I'm very excited to be your host today for this very special session. We all get to be the very first festival audience for this book that got launched just 2 days ago. And we have the author with us. Today, the title of our talk is Science for Humans, which is a little bit puzzling because we're not talking about science for aliens, are we now? So let's just say that we've got the leading science authors and the leading science broadcasters here with us today. Without further ado, I'm going to welcome them on stage and then introduce them to you. So please give them a warm round of applause. So Dr. Adam Rutherford is a top British broadcaster and author of How to Argue with a Racist. He's already signed my book and a couple of the others as well. Do make sure you catch him later for the book signings and he'll sign yours as well. Dr. Mohamed Qasem, you will also be doing book signings afterwards. A top leading science communicator here in the Arab world, and your book, Things You Cannot Imagine, has been selected by the UAE's Ministry of Education for the school curriculum. So we're going to be delving into that and listening about exactly what makes science tick here in the Middle East. Now, first of all, a little confession. I'm not a scientist, but I am a science enthusiast. So let me just check with the crowd here, with a show of hands. Who would say in the crowd that you're a scientist, you study the sciences, or you're studying the sciences now? Okay, so we're in good company. We're in good company. Let's turn to our first scientist here, Dr. Adam Rutherford. Why this book and why now?
Well, why now is an interesting question. That part of the argument is that certainly in the UK and in the West, and I'm primarily talking about race from a Western perspective in the book, there has been a vocal rise in the expression of racism. And as there's been an increase in our understanding of human genetics in the last few years, there has also been what I argue is a co-opting of some very real and interesting science to justify racist positions by well-meaning people, but also by far-right, overt racists. And so the aim of the book is to equip people. It's quite belligerent, it's quite a pugnacious book. I do like a fight. But it is to equip people with the scientific tools to undermine racist arguments. I don't think we're ever going to cure racism. But what I'm saying is that you can't have science as your tools because they're my tools, and they're better than your tools.
Well, I think something that sums up how it is an ally, how science is an ally for you, is a killer quote in the book. Every Nazi has a Jewish ancestor. Unpack that for us, please.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. So one of the chapters is on our understanding of genealogy and family trees and ancestry. And humans are very tribal, and we have identities which are cultural, and they may be, sporting, or where you're born, or your family. We have all these different sort of nests of identities that we create for ourselves. Racial purity is a really important idea for white supremacists, because the notion that you are not tainted with the blood of others other than Northern Europeans is essential to establishing their own supposed superiority. Guys, we've really got into this early on a Saturday morning.
We've gone in for the big stuff. We've gone in for the big stuff.
But actually, the concept of racial purity is a nonsense because of one clear biological fact that is so obvious that everyone always ignores it, which is that everyone had two parents. And that means that as you go back through time, the number of ancestors you have doubles. So you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. Which means that the number of ancestors you have is, it's hardly an equation, but it is 2 to the power of n, where n is the number of generations. Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
We're following so far.
Okay. If you go back 40 generations, which is about 1,000 years ago, one individual will have more than 1 trillion ancestors by that method. Yes? Agreed?
Yes.
Okay. 2 to the power of 40. But that is 10 times more people than have ever existed on this planet.
Ah.
Family trees don't look like trees at all. They look like trees at the beginning, and then they begin to collapse in on themselves. And what we see is that you actually have 1 trillion positions on your family tree, but they're occupied by the same people many, many times over. And so what that means is that you might have a branch which goes like this, and then at some point in your past, those 2 branches will cross through an individual, and you will be descended from that individual twice. Now, that happens after only a few generations, but eventually, this is a long answer, eventually, all your lines of your family tree begin to cross through all individuals. And in fact, all lines of all people's ancestry begins to cross through all individuals. And that, for Europe, that date comes out as about 1,000 years ago, which means that everyone in Europe is descended from everyone in Europe 1,000 years ago. And this is called the isopoint. The global isopoint is about the 14th century BC. So literally everyone on Earth is descended from exactly the same people about 3,500 years ago, which means that mathematically, I mean, like, we're probably 4th cousins, and we've never met. Of course. We're probably closer because we both have Indian heritage.
It's a big family reunion, this is what it all is, yes.
If an English person sits in a room full of 100 other English people, they are statistically almost certainly sitting within 4 seats of a 3rd cousin that they've never met.
As you say, it's a big, this is a big family reunion.
We are terribly inbred.
Or if we put it more diplomatically, the title of part 2 is Your Ancestors Are My Ancestors.
Exactly.
And maybe that's a more diplomatic way to put it this early in the morning.
Exactly. And the genetics has got to the stage where we can really, really tease out very, very fine differences between populations, even between countries, but with different ancestries. But fundamentally, these are such small proportions of the total similarities that we have that it's very difficult to say I am pure anything. You can't say I'm pure anything because the concept of racial purity is just not scientific.
And when you say not scientific, what we're talking about here in this book, which really is a timely toolkit, and it's the perfect size that you can just slip it in your bag and pull it out whenever you need to, like, put someone in their place.
It's a hardback as well, so if the argument doesn't work, you can just hit them.
It really is a toolkit, therefore, in every sense of the word. We talk about scientific fact and how you, I guess, divide it from fiction. But when you do that, you take on, some pretty big foes here. You're basically challenging the giants of the science world. There's a particular quote here you have on page 181, and I don't think this is a spoiler alert, but we'll just go for it here. We celebrate the fact that science is an endeavor built upon past knowledge, with the maxim that we see further by standing on the shoulders of giants. We must also be aware of the centuries of pseudoscience perpetrated by men of power on whose shoulders we also stand, because their ideas have percolated through time and persist within science and society to this day, no matter how offensive, no matter how out of date or absurd they might be. So you're taking on the giants of science and saying, well, I've got a few things to point out here.
Yeah.
Has that caused a backlash?
Well, let's find out. It's only 2 days old. I think it's really... Scientists love history, and they love the history of their own fields, but it tends to be not a total history. It tends... Maybe Mohamed can comment on this, because I know you know your history of science as well. But when scientists look at history, I think they tend to look at a very... sort of a channel which allows them to talk about the contemporary science, which is interesting. And so often we ignore the broader sweep of history. And so, for example, one of the giants you're talking about in that section is one of the great heroes of the Western Enlightenment, which is Voltaire. A true hero of this era of scientific revolutions and Enlightenment thinking and the beginning of the science as we see it today. Voltaire was an unbelievable racist. He believed that black people were a different species to white people and other people around the world. All of these categorizations that were introduced in the 17th and 18th century by Western philosophers such as Hume and scientists like Linnaeus and Voltaire and so on, they were all intrinsically hierarchical. They weren't simply taxonomizing people by saying, these people look like this and these that look like this. They were saying, these people look like this and they're lazy. And these people look like this and they are stupid. And these people look white and are graceful and intelligent. And all of the hierarchies that emerged from this period put white Europeans at the top of the pile. And so it's pseudoscience for that reason. People are different around the world, but we cannot nowadays rectify that with behaviors and qualities that were bound up in this period. Because the reason they were doing this was because it made it easier to sell enslavement.
And as you say, these observations are really shocking. But if we look at it in the context of what was happening in history at the time, is it anachronistic to sit here now and to judge those scientists and voicing the potential backlash?
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
I think it's not because they just observed the world and they judged it this way. It's because of how we are made. We're made so that we can separate different things into categories. We find patterns in the world, and we try to make them in groups. And that's how actually AI works. So the world is full of patterns, and we try to find them. At that time, they didn't have DNA. So there's no way for them to group things in a way that we are grouping them now. So you can't really blame them for making this mistake, because they were doing what they do best, which is look at things and put them in their categories as they saw them then.
Well, yes and no. I agree with that in principle, that we do, what I refer to as the tyranny of the discontinuous mind, right? That we really try hard to put things in clear boxes. But evolution and human variation doesn't adhere to clear boxes. Some of the guys at that time, some of the scientists, notably a German scientist called Gottfried von Herder, managed to describe humankind in a really accurate way and said that there aren't discrete boundaries between races and there aren't discrete boundaries between skin color and pigmentation, but what we actually see is continuity that reflects human history. Have you heard of Gottfried von Herder?
No.
Neither have I. Neither is anyone.
Well, I'm
and
sure
the reason was because Kant was his big opposer.
Right.
And everyone, Kant was a big man.
The information wasn't communicated well at the time as well.
Yeah.
So therefore, you can't even blame them because they saw the world the way they saw it. So now you can blame people because science is available, and they should look at it and try to understand how the world works in a better view, in a better tool.
Yeah.
I guess this comes back to the point that it's possibly anachronistic, but as Adam says, there were scientists at the time who weren't espousing such racist views, and potentially the classification was to form an agenda, to actually justify an agenda, which we all know now as colonialism.
Well, right, and I think that you've identified exactly the problem with the way that history goes, which is that today we are capable of harvesting enormous amounts of data, and then we, as scientists, we release this into the world, and people interpret it, and it becomes politicized. People have ideologies.
Absolutely.
After we've created the data. What part of the argument here is that in the 17th and 18th century, it is the other way round. So they've already decided what the ideology is, and then science gets co-opted into that. And so therefore, these pseudo-scientific classifications occur, but they are hierarchical. So they're hierarchical because the ideology is in place before the data was.
Right.
And I guess that brings us on to the question of, can science be apolitical? Is it something that exists in a vacuum, or is it something that does need to reflect the current political situation? I guess I'm answering your question, the question to you myself, in the sense there's a real motivation behind why this book came out now.
Yeah. Science should be apolitical. It should be neutral. Data should be neutral. And that's, in principle, the only way that this endeavor that we've committed our lives to works. It never is.
Yes,
so data should be apolitical, yes, but data is not apolitical. So there was a study that was done, there's a study, I think from Harvard, a scientist by the name of Mahzarin Banaji, and she did a study on people, and you can take this test yourself on Harvard webpage, where she finds implicit biases in us. It's not biases that are shown visibly. For example, I would say that I do not discriminate between whites and blacks, fat and thin, tall and short. I don't do that. I know that for a fact, and if you test me, I will show you that I don't. But it turns out that people have innate biases. They're internalized, and they come out when you're tested quickly. So I took the test, and I did not know that I was biased towards younger people than older people. And that was implicit within me. And in fact, there was a story about this person who was on the street, and he was driving. He stopped his car in the middle of the street, and a woman called the police because this guy looked strange and he was kind of hallucinating. And the police came over, and the helicopter was going on top, and they're narrating what's happening. And so one of the police officers there held a gun at the guy. He was a black person, and she told him to go back to his car, and he was walking slowly, and he put his hands into his pocket, and as soon as he pulled it out, she shot him, and she killed him. And he died on the way to the hospital. And why would she do that when she was tested, she was asked? She has no prejudice against black people, but it turns out that there is an implicit bias. If a black person goes into his pocket to take something out, which he was taking out his wallet to give his ID, she quickly responded by shooting him because he was black. So these innate biases are available in us, and we don't see them because that's the way we behave. We don't see them. We try to think that we are not biased, but we are biased. And the data, and so let's go back to the data. The data that we make, it's any article that we write, anything that we talk about, has content within it that shows that we are biased, but it's implicit. And in fact, another scientist took this data, and she tried to see whether artificial intelligence would take this data and become biased. And it turns out that when artificial intelligence took the data, grouped things, looked for patterns, it became biased itself, and it became biased against women, for example. And for example, it would find that in nursing, women would be the more appropriate people to go into nursing as opposed to men, while nursing should not be categorized as such. So data should not be biased,
right,
but unfortunately it is.
There was an amazing study, and this is in your field now, so I reported on a study that came out in 2017, I think it was, and it was about AI in relation to driverless cars. And I don't know whether you know, but there's a classic philosophical study which is called the trolley problems, and they relate to making moral decisions about whether you would allow someone to die, even though that the same number of people would die in a different scenario. We don't need to go into them now. But anyway, did you know the paper I'm referring to, where
there's an MIT paper that they tested people
regionally around the world to see whether how would they respond if their AI in their driverless car was in a situation where someone was going to die as a result of an accident. And they asked people to vary their responses according to whether that person was old or young or a man or a woman, or I think there was ethnicity in there as well. But what reminded me is when you said that you had a preference for younger people. In East Asian cultures, one of the most striking results in this test was that there was a slight but significant bias towards older people.
Yes.
And in the West, it tended to be a preference for youth. And so it's an innate bias. Is it biological? Is it learned? I don't really know. I don't know whether we do know.
Some of the things are not necessarily learned. It's the nature of how our brains are. We have neurons, and neurons actually do their best when they are actually categorizing things. In fact, some of it is taught, but it's taught only because this is how we are. When we were younger, when we were little, they would teach us to categorize fruit, vegetables, numbers, colors, and things like that, so that we can understand how the world works. And in fact, initially when we're first born, we can't see things clearly, but then suddenly you have edges around people that kids can detect, but they can't see the full picture. And then slowly, slowly, they become capable of separating things. And so this is crucial because we can't survive without separating things. So if I don't know a poisonous fruit from a fruit that is good for me, then I would probably die. So the thing is, it's important for us, but then it's because of our nature that tries to categorize things that we take this and we apply it to everything else. And we try to become, for example, if we dislike black people or we dislike fat people or whatever the case might be. So it's natural, but then we have to modify our behaviors to overcome these issues.
And I guess question ourselves when actually those prejudices are based on falsification or somebody else's agenda, which is where the challenging the pseudoscience comes back to. Now, Mohamed, you talked about your innate bias for the youth, which is quite handy because, of course, you are a leading science communicator here in the Arab world with your podcast, Scyware, and the book on the curriculum as well, Things You Cannot Imagine. A question to you both, really, when you're communicating the world of science for the youth, how do you balance making science more accessible without dumbing it down?
That's a good question. So yes, it's really hard. Once you water down science, it becomes less scientific. The only place where you can find real science is in papers, because it doesn't necessarily describe anything. Usually you find math, and the math doesn't tell exactly how things work. It gives you answers, but it doesn't tell you in words how things work. So we have to take this and turn it into words where people can access it. But as soon as we do that, we lose some of the science. And then, so there's a balance between the two. You either make it really easy to understand, and then you lose the science completely, or you make it really hard to understand, and you lose the communication part. So I'm trying to find a balance between those two, trying to make it easy, trying to get the best examples I find from the world, from scientists, and I try to communicate that to the Arab world as best as I can and get them interested in it.
And does it help, for example, to look at science from a more youthful perspective? I know that, Adam, in your book of Humans here, you look at the idea of an alien scientist landing on Earth, and how would they perceive the values, the systems, the way that we live our lives, and kind of seeing science through that perspective. Is that what you try to do? You try and put yourself into that position of the influences that the youthful generation might have, and an alien.
I should say something. Adam here was the science advisor for the movie Ex Machina, which is a great movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but this is one of the best things I just come to know. And it's important for people like Adam to be available in this world to help us understand science through movies. Yes.
I think storytelling is a really big part of getting that balance right. How do you engage? Because even a scientific paper has a narrative to it. I mean, mostly incomprehensible to almost everyone in the world. But there is a structure to it. And good papers, even if they're technical, you can read them even though they're outside of your field.
Yeah, if they're good, yes. Depends on the topic, and depends on the field.
And I guess that's what I'm coming to. Do you try to, when targeting a youthful audience, look at reaching for examples from media, movies, graphic novels, etc.?
Yes.
So using these devices.
Yeah. So one of the things I do, which is I do comics. So I write a story, science fiction story, that is related to the topic I'm going to be talking about, and I find an artist online, and they would do the whole thing, and I put it into a story form, And I start my talks with a comic-style scientific communication tool, this tool here. And this gets people to get glued to my talks. I get them in, get them to think about the topic in as deep as I can possibly get them. And then I go into the science, and then I show them videos of what's going on, because people always look at their phones all the time, and they watch YouTube. And so now I want to use their habits of what they do on a daily basis to bring them into science. And it's not always easy, but so far it's worked for me. And so that's one way. Another way is, and that's for a certain type of people, younger people. If you go a little older, then you'd go to the podcast where I give more in-depth information about the topics I talk about. And I try to capture their minds as opposed to their hearts when it comes to science. And then so it depends on who I'm talking to that I try to give them information in different ways.
And when it comes to deciding what you might be focusing on next, the theme of this whole festival is tomorrow. You're shaping the minds of tomorrow. You're contemplating the big questions of tomorrow. Are there particular topics which are obvious to you that you really want to delve into? Or how does one decide? How do you evolve onto a book like this from your legacy of books?
Genetics and AI. I mean, basically, that's the future.
Yes.
But I think I got lucky in that I went to university to do medicine, but I came from a medical family, and at the time it was very easy to get in to do medicine. I had no intention of being a doctor at all, and the only subject that really turned me on was genetics. And this was 1993, so this is at exactly the time when the Human Genome Project was starting. I actually tried to get onto a classics course at University College London, but they wouldn't take me because my grades weren't good enough. So I did genetics instead.
So we're lucky.
I was lucky. I mean, so incredibly lucky to have stumbled into a field at exactly the point where it was about to hit boom time. And then I finished my PhD in 2001, which was when the Human Genome Project finished. And that project, so this is the first time that we ever sequenced the entire genetic material of a human, it revealed that we didn't understand at all how genetics worked. And the press went nuts for this at the time, because they were saying it was a waste of money, or it meant that we'd been doing it wrong. But actually, it showed the exact opposite. It showed exactly what we want in science, which is to remove our preconceptions. And the only way we do that is by doing experiments. And so we came out of the Human Genome Project saying, oh, so what we previously thought was completely wrong, now we know the questions to ask. I'm going to invoke one of the worst people in history who said one of the stupidest things ever, which was also incredibly profound at the same time. It was Donald Rumsfeld, who, when talking about weapons of mass destruction,
yes, I remember,
said, there are known unknowns and there are unknown unknowns, and we have to convert the unknown unknowns into known unknowns. And everyone went, what an idiot. Actually, it's really profound in the science of the sort of philosophical scientific way, because what we were doing in the Human Genome Project is we were in unknown territory. And when we did that project, then we were in known unknown territory, which meant that we knew what we had to do.
Did you write that in your book?
Yeah.
You should buy your book.
Yes. He'll even sign it for you later. We want to see an exchange. Mohamed's book needs to be... is it going to be translated into English? 'Cause
I don't know, to be honest.
Okay. Maybe this is the place where it needs to happen at the festival.
Well, I looked online at some of the graphic novels, and I'm a big comic fan.
No, before you go into that, I want you to finish what you said about the unknown.
No, well, merely that is the scientific process. That you need to do enough experiments to work out what the future is, what the experiments you need to do, and you can't do that by not having a background, not having a sort of framework to do it in. So converting unknown unknowns into known unknowns is exactly where you want to be in science. Because I remember people in the press at the time in 2001 or 2 saying, what a waste of money, we haven't cured any diseases, which still remains true for the Human Genome Project. But what it did was allow us to work out what the right questions to ask were. And we didn't know what the right questions were before we'd done all that work. So you were saying that this is all based on asking the question, what is the future? How do we set ourselves up for the future? We now know why we don't understand why human genetics isn't the way it was before. Did you follow that?
Yes, yes. We've gone on a journey.
Yes, which means that we don't know how human genetics works, but we understand why we don't know why human genetics works.
Yes.
Whereas before that, we didn't know what we didn't know. Wow.
So we're all in the business of communication. How does
Which
one...
I think I really demonstrated badly then.
We'll forgive you. How does one make sure that the knowns, based on the truth, are communicated with the same rigor and force and reach the mass audience as much as those facts which are masquerading as facts, but they're not really facts. The pseudoscience, which seems to just go on fire and go viral, and it's reaching all these various different audiences that we can't even reach with the actual science. How do you as communicators try to balance that?
Before I go into this, I want to answer the first question.
Please do.
The one question before this. So here we are talking about science. You're talking about knowns, unknowns, and you're talking about science as if it is natural for us to talk about it. And this is not the case here in the Middle East. You're asking, we're supposed to be telling kids now about science so that they grow and become scientists and then maybe help the region flourish. And this is a big problem for me because I don't think that we should be teaching only kids. I think we should be teaching everyone. We are already behind in the Middle East. We're already behind in the Arab world. From the rest of the world, the East and the West are superpowers in science. And China now is advancing in AI faster than any country in the world. And I'm worried. I'm worried that this is not happening here. And trying to communicate, I tell people that I usually want to have kids know about science, but I'm terrified because by the time kids have science, science in the world is advancing so fast that it's impossible to catch up with anything. So Sheikh Mohamed bin Rashid always tries to accelerate things. If you go into the governmental buildings, you'll see 10x acceleration. And it's hard to do that, and I don't know how this should be done. I don't know how I can get people interested and at the same time go fast enough to catch up with the rest of the world. So teaching kids or making kids love science will be too late by the time they reach
adulthood.
Adulthood, yes.
Well, I think that's a really powerful insight and observation you shared with us, and we are going to open it to the audience very shortly with your questions. But if you have contributions on that point, we'd be really happy to hear them. I think it does relate. Yes, please do.
I think I completely agree, and I think that I've thought about this a lot over my career in the UK and in the West. And I think that there is a misunderstanding, there's a fundamental cultural misunderstanding of what science is. And we reinforce that by the way we teach science, which is that it's a bank of knowledge. It's things that we know, and the new things replace older things that we know. And that isn't what science is. Science is a way of learning. It's a way of finding out knowledge. And, for example, we don't teach, in the UK, we don't teach probability or risk at all. Even if you go to like advanced maths A level, you do some statistics, but we don't teach risk or probability. And I think that is such a fundamental bedrock of all the sciences, no matter what branch you end up in, whether it's genetics or AI or climate change or whatever. To understand probability and risk as a basis for understanding the best way to find things out, which is what science is just so fundamental to it. And we spend so much time, I teach at UCL, we spend so much time teaching, unlearning, getting children to unlearn stuff that they've learned at school.
Please don't keep them going, because
they're
doing great.
Sure, but we teach them things which are not true.
Oh, of course, yeah. Misconceptions, yeah.
Yeah, and in genetics, it's really, I have stood in front of 16-year-olds, I do it every year, and I teach them about the genetics of things like eye color, which is as it is written in the textbook, because it's such a textbook example of how we understand genetics. And the exam questions on eye color will say, describe the gene patterns so that we understand how eyes are determined. It's not true. It's not even vaguely true. And it's an absolutely standard example. It's the best way we can teach kids how to understand how genetics works. And at first year undergraduate, I have to say to them, remember that thing we taught you 2 years ago about how eye color works and genes? Yeah, well, it's not true.
Okay, so explain to the rest of us who are puzzled why that's happening. Is it the dumbing down? Is it simplifying science?
It is, yes, that's what it is. It's what you were talking about at the beginning. It's a really difficult balance to give people enough information that you can then tell them how things actually are. Because if we went, genetics, AI, climate change, these are ridiculously complicated areas which require incredibly powerful statistics and a sophisticated understanding to unpack them. We have to teach simple things. We have to teach simple narratives, and we have to teach facts, because otherwise no one would even start. But it's just the balance. It's how you get the balance from saying you need to know this amount of information before you can start thinking about why this might be incorrect or what the next stage is. I think part of the problem is that sometimes we just give fact after fact after fact after fact, and we don't teach people what science actually is, which is a set of tools for finding out how things work.
An analytical mindset.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And do you think this comes down to something that I guess I was guilty of in my introduction when I confessed to not being a scientist? I also see it in a binary way. Either you are someone of the arts or you're someone of the sciences. That actually we put these subjects into silos where life overlaps.
Yeah.
And Mohamed, in your examples, when you're teaching the younger generations, I guess you try to draw on these areas that overlap, to draw them in, to get their attention.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So I'm trying to talk about many different topics of science, which I'm not an expert in, but I try to get the experts to talk through me, and I give them all different kinds of sciences, and I try to make it as true as possible. So but the issue again is getting them to like science quickly, the older generation as well, because we need to move fast. We need to really move fast.
On that note, I think we should move fast to the floor and ask if there's any questions here, and we can send a few mics around. I know Adam has a wonderful technique. He likes to alternate between the men and the women in the room, girls and boys. And
there's a reason for that, which is not me being politically correct.
Ooh.
It is based on published research, which is that if women ask questions first, then more women ask questions.
Excellent.
But if men ask questions first, then no women ask questions.
Wow.
I will use that in my talks.
It's really
next time.
powerful. It really works.
But it can't be a scientific experiment today, because I've been asking the questions first.
That is true. That is true.
But we can see what happens with the floor. Let's see who asks the question
really good, do
first.
it.
I will do
It
it.
really makes a difference.
Yes, definitely.
I did think it was PC. I credited you for that. So, we have.
Well, let's start
we have a
with-
lady in the third row. So let's see what pattern this sets.
Okay, when you were talking about the artificial intelligence with the self-driving cars, you said that sometimes they're biased for deaths and dangerous situations. But then, I don't know if I didn't hear who you said the artificial intelligence was biased against at the end of that, for the deaths or in a dangerous situation. Did you say what the answer was?
I don't think I explained it very well at all, is the first thing to say. Can you help out with me on this? It's more your field.
My understanding is, no, they're not biased towards anything. The bias that I talked about was in taking articles in and finding bias in them. But for cars, they're definitely trying not to make them biased. So yes, so don't think about being biased against people, whether it's color or size or so. That's definitely out of the picture.
I
yeah.
just thought you said in an emergency situation they were trying to decide what the bias was.
So there are some of the biases that are emerging in emerging AI technologies are some of them are like really obvious. So for example, there's been a couple of studies shown in the States where for things like automatic hand dryers, which are detecting pigmentation, and they've been designed by white people, and they don't work on black people. And it's kind of so obvious that you don't even think about it until you realize, if you've got very dark skin, that it doesn't work. It doesn't actually work for me at all. And one of the reasons you get around that, which I think is really interesting for science and culture generally, is to have more diverse workforces. And so if you have black people in your team, they're going to point out, this isn't working for me right now. But it's kind of like a data in, data out problem. You know, the AIs are only as smart as the data that we feed them.
There was an example that happened in 2016. Google had their first AI that distinguishes people, pictures, things in facial, not just facial recognition, object recognition, and facial recognition. And there was someone posted on Twitter a picture with people in it, several pictures, and Google identified everyone except the ones with black people in it. They had them, it was written under them gorilla. And this was a huge problem. And so they stopped the algorithm right away because it was biased. And then they started removing the bias from this algorithm, but it didn't succeed, and they haven't posted it back online yet. However, they removed this bias to the point that now if it sees a gorilla, it does not know that it is a gorilla. So
I didn't see that, but I think that's
is hard.
definitely something I'd be looking up straight after this talk. That sounds incredibly shocking and incredibly a challenge that needs to be addressed. The gentleman in the back is waiting patiently, and then we need to come to the front as well.
Yes, intelligence tests, IQ tests, appear to show different results for different races. Is that cultural, or is the whole thing meaningless?
Big question, thank you.
Well, that's chapter 4 in my new book. So thank you for asking. And you're right that the first thing to say, I'll keep this as brief as I can because this is literally the most controversial and biggest subject in the whole of science. So to answer it in 2 sentences is not easy. If the data is correct, and we think it is, and IQ tests, which are culturally biased and do measure how good you are at IQ tests, the fact that we've done so many of them for more than a century means there is validity in the data itself. And yes, we do see regional differences in how people perform, how countries and populations perform in IQ tests. The best explanation is not that these are biological innate differences, but they are predicated on different cultural facets that have emerged since we've been testing. And the reason I say this is because there's a very interesting phenomenon known as the Flynn effect. Has anyone heard of the Flynn effect? Okay, well, the Flynn effect is that since we started measuring IQ tests in the 1920s or 30s, on average, populations increase their IQ by 3 points every decade. And there are multiple reasons for this, but they're to do with better healthcare, better education, better socioeconomic statements, just general development. Also, as countries become more developed, their education systems tend to skew towards more abstract thinking, which is what IQ tests measure accurately. Now, when we see that, for example, in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, their IQ, the national IQs are significantly lower than Western countries. The best explanation is not genetic. We have found genetic differences between populations, but we can't correlate them with IQ specifically. The best explanation is that the Flynn effect hasn't taken place in countries in sub-Saharan Africa due to development, due to cultural reasons. And just finish this quickly, because I can talk about this for about 24 hours without breathing. If you were to take a country, if you take the Netherlands, Holland, if you take that out of Europe and say that you just remove the Flynn effect from Holland, then the national IQ in Holland today would be 80, which is extremely low and lower than any other country on earth. In that time, that isn't enough time for there to be genetic differences whatsoever. So all of that difference can be accounted for by societal, by socio-economic and education purposes. And now you don't have to buy the book.
And we have a gentleman patiently waiting in the front row here.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. Actually, I have a continuation to her question. I really liked it. And plus, I have other two questions, but I'll read them in different intervals. So someone else can.
That's very
Just
patient.
referring back to her question, when she talked about the artificial intelligence and in times, or let's say, when there is an accident happening, and we have an artificial intelligence, let's say car, driving or self-driving car, and it's going to hit someone or suddenly something happened. I just remember the movie, a science fiction called I, Robot, when the robot just entered and saved, let's say, like the actor Will Smith at that time, rather than saving the girl who was drowning in the car. It's because the robot has calculated that the percentage of saving him is more than the percentage of saving the girl who was drowning in that car. So do we call that a bias, or we call it, let's say, like the logic or the calculation behind it? I just would like to hear your thoughts about it, please.
Mohamed, if you want to take
yeah,
that one.
that's a really good question.
A hard question.
Yeah, it's a very hard question. That's true. It's like taxonomy in evolution and animals. You can't really tell the species exactly. So in the same way, you can't tell when something becomes a bias and when it's proper categorization. So also, we don't know how a robot would, not just a robot, any AI would react in a situation, because even today, there is no way to know how it's thinking, how it's going to reach its decision. So is that a bias, or is that proper math? Is that the right way? Nobody knows. There is no way to, I don't think there is a way to know this.
So I teach medical students, and part of one of their modules is medical ethics, which is, of course is incredibly important. And we put to them ethical dilemmas that they will have to face, especially in emergency situations where they have to make decisions like this. Now, the key outcome is that there is no right decision. But it's situations such as there's been an attack, there's a bomb's gone off, you are triaging, and there is a 9-year-old girl there with an open chest wound, and there is a 85-year-old woman who's got a shattered pelvis, and there's someone else. And there's only one of you. You've got limited resources. And what we try to get them to do there is just to rationalize as much as they can the decision-making process about who they're going to treat, which is a very real-world scenario. And of course, there are no right answers. One can be too rational about those situations. But I think in those types of tutorials, what we're trying to do is to make sure that they're thinking quickly and rationally enough that they're not making the wrong decision in every direction. The other argument, the other outcome, which about 50% of the students get, is the first thing they do is ask someone else. Because these types of decisions, which have a very deep moral and ethical framework to them, are always best made in communication with other people.
One of the things that this question handles is not just what's happening in the situation, it's the consequences as well. Who do we punish at the end of the day when all this is done? The problem with this is, there's a case, I think it was Mercedes-Benz, don't quote me, I think it's one of that they were developing their AI to save the driver at all costs. So sometimes you hit children or older people, or you crash into the side and die. And Mercedes-Benz did that so that they saved the person in the car at all cost. And there was a backlash. So the question is, how do you train a neural network at the end of the day? How do you train it in a way that you yourself don't know what the outcome would be, and then we're all satisfied that the decision was made without prior knowledge of us, what's going to happen? Or should we do it in a way that we know exactly the outcome and bear the consequences?
Because humans don't work like that, do they? I mean, the reason accidents happen is because we swerve to avoid killing people. If saving the driver was the only concern, we would just drive in straight lines. Mm-hmm. Loads of people would die.
I know that the lady here has a mic, so we may come back to your additional questions and the gentleman next after the lady. She has the mic first of all. Sorry, we're just going to, because the lady's patiently waiting, we're going to give her a chance. Do please.
Dr. Mohamed, I have a question for you. As an educator, I teach young kids, and I have a science background, and for me, teaching science is the most fun. But you're so concerned, rightly so, for educating older people in sciences. But my concern is the teachers who don't feel comfortable teaching science. And I find that as someone who is and who loves it, I see teachers who aren't, and the children think differently. How can you help, or how can we help in that way to help educate the educators?
Wow, so the educators don't want to educate the kids in science? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, usually it's an uncomfortable topic because they don't, science makes people, if I'm not a scientist, I can't do science, which is never really the fact. But since my background is in science, it's for me, I try to put science in every part, but it is usually the topic that, if can be avoided, will be avoided.
So, okay, I didn't know that this was the case. I was always working on the dads and moms, trying to convince them to stay out of the way, please. Because mostly dads and parents are not good in science, so they usually give misinformation to their kids. So I try to educate them, and at the same time I try to make sure that they do not stop their kids from going into science. But now you're telling me this, so I have to work harder now to focus on the people who are educating other people. Yeah. The only thing I would say is just keep on doing what you're doing, which is give the kids science. And I think science communicators now are working harder in this region. And hopefully, with time, they will disarm people to let science seep into the minds of kids. Yeah.
And you're doing the fact that you've got astronauts now from the UAE.
Yeah.
On the ISS, that role model thing cannot be underestimated. And you see people who are within your demographic, or people you recognize, or who do amazing science, then that is, I think that's a really big factor in getting people.
I'm so glad that Adam mentioned that, because it's plugging the session that's going to happen in half an hour, which I'm hosting with the astronauts. So please do come to that. Yeah. And you too as well. I'm just going to take the very last question, because we don't want to be rude to the gentleman who wanted to ask the question. Yes, we have time for a very quick question and very quick answers.
Yeah, I just want to thank the panel first, and there is so many interesting issues about science and abuse of science and politicization of science, and when we move from categorizing to stereotyping, I think there has to be a line, and you have to draw the line somewhere. And the question of IQ, of course, why do we still call it intelligence? I mean, just by calling the IQ test intelligence quotient is racist, definitely, because there are all kinds of intelligence. As you said, it tests abstract thinking. Okay, people who don't have abstract thinking, but they have emotional intelligence or physical intelligence or retentive or poetic. So by calling it intelligence is a racist term. Now, my question is not about that.
Very quickly,
my
please.
question is, is a very brief one about ancestry. You know these people who publish on TV your DNA, and you find out your background and so on. I mean, it really kills me when I have friends who say, whoa, I sent them a letter, I gave them so much money to find out, my cousin somewhere and stuff like that. Is that really scientific?
Well, I think that's a really brilliant question because it's exactly what Adam addresses in his book. So a very quick answer on that, and then we are going to wrap up.
Yeah, that's chapter 2. So you're all asking the right questions here, obviously. The answer is no. I think those tests, well, just briefly, DNA is incredibly good at identifying very close relatives, so brothers, sisters, and immediate family. And so the revolution that has occurred in commercial genetic testing has really helped a lot of people to establish their familial relationships. We're in an era when a generation of people may have been fathered during the Second World War, and so there's a lot of adoptees and so on, and things like that. DNA has been very, very powerful for that. The relationship between DNA and other people drops off a cliff after about third cousins. And so if you do one of those tests and it says, we've identified someone who might be a third cousin of yours, you look at the amount of DNA that you're sharing with them, and it's 0.1 to 0.9%. So it's almost non-existent. I'm not in the business of telling people how to spend their money. I think that I'm in the business, like Mohamed, of telling you what these things actually are and how the science actually works, and for other people for you to make a decision about how to spend your money. I think that they are at best trivial and at worst pernicious. And what I mean, and that is why I've actually written about them in 2 different books, but it's in the race book because I get emails every week from white people who want to find out they're descended from Vikings, okay? And because of that thing we were talking about at the beginning, about the way family trees work, all white people are descended from Vikings. I can tell you that for free. You don't have to pay me £100 and spit in a tube for that. But at the pernicious end of the scale, white supremacists are obsessed with this, absolutely obsessed with trying to establish a notion of racial purity, and they do it via these tests. Now, there is one study, which I talk about in the book, about how on a particular neo-Nazi website, which is very, very popular, people who've done these tests and discovered that they have recent African or Middle Eastern descent, and they freak out, and just cataloguing their responses to discovering that as someone who defined themselves as being opposed to Jews or Arabs or black people actually has a great-grandparent that was one. The responses, none of them are that they changed their mind. The responses are all just excuses for why the test is wrong, the company is wrong, the company is run by Jews, which is why it's wrong, and so on. And so in that case, there's a maxim by the writer Jonathan Swift from the 17th century, which is that you can't reason a person out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. And in that sense, I'm never going to win an argument with those guys. But what I am saying is you can't have science to have, as part of your defense.
And I think on that note, what we have to say is that both the work that you're both doing here about challenging the misinformation and the misuse of science, but also celebrating how science really can be our ally and really is our weapon in tackling a brighter future. I think we need to give them a round of applause for that.